They kicked out the Chinese. Everything broke. They told China's executives to leave, and within days, fuel stopped flowing. Diesel prices reported to rise by about 300% after the expulsions. Niger isn't just a small town with a spare gas station down the road. It's a whole country whose economy suddenly depended on outside experts to keep the lights on and engines running. When those experts were ordered out on short notice, the machines only kept working if people who knew how to run them were still there. They weren't. The result was dramatic. Refineries slowed or stopped, pipelines were paused, and all of a sudden there was less fuel than before. Less supply, plus the same demand, means prices explode. That's basic supply and demand, but, on a national scale. Here are 2 quick facts so you get the stakes. First, Niger's leaders issued a 48-hour ultimatum asking senior Chinese executives to leave and froze Chinese commercial accounts. Second, within a week, local reports say fuel availability collapsed and prices spiked. Ordinary people couldn't afford to cook, shop, or commute. It's kind of like asking the pilots off a passenger jet mid-flight and expecting the plane to land on its own. That image makes the technical risk pretty obvious, even to a 14-year-old. So why did the government take such a risky step? Was the problem really only about salaries, or was there something more under the surface? And now that Niger is hurting, can it get China's help back, or is that bridge burned? To answer that, first we need to understand who Niger is and why China mattered so much. To understand what happened, we have to see the bigger picture. What kind of country Niger is, and why foreign help, especially from China, became so important in the first place. Niger sits in the heart of West Africa. It's enormous, more than 1.2 million square kilometers, about twice the size of France, but it's landlocked, surrounded by desert, and home to only around 27 million people. That means plenty of land, but not much easy access to the sea or major trade routes. Imagine living in a country that's as big as a continent but has no coastline. Every import, every export must cross someone else's border. That alone makes things more expensive. Economically, Niger has always struggled. In 2023, the average income per person was just $642 a year. That's less than $2 a day. The United Nations even classifies Niger as one of the world's least developed countries. Despite this, the land hides enormous natural wealth, especially uranium and oil. Niger's uranium reserves rank 4th in the world, and its oil reserves are measured in the hundreds of millions of tons. On paper, that sounds like the ingredients for prosperity. But in reality, those resources didn't lift the country out of poverty, because having raw materials isn't the same as having the tools, money, or technology to use them. It's like owning a gold mine but not having the machinery to dig. Niger had the treasure underground, but no way to bring it up efficiently. Without that ability, the economy leaned heavily on agriculture and livestock, industries that depend on rain and good soil. The problem? 2/3 of Niger is covered by the Sahara Desert. The heat is brutal, rainfall is scarce, and most of the soil is poor. Farmers can only grow a few drought-resistant crops, and even then, yields are low. That means Niger still imports a large share of its food just to feed its people. Animal husbandry, raising livestock, is better developed. There are around 30 million animals in the country, almost 1 per person, making it a vital part of rural life. But even that doesn't generate enough income to lift families out of poverty. So despite vast land and mineral wealth, everyday life remains hard. Few stable jobs, limited electricity, and one of the lowest literacy rates in the region. Faced with these limits, Niger's leaders began to look outward. They needed partners who could bring in money, machines, and know-how. Someone willing to invest in long-term growth rather than short-term profit. Most Western countries weren't interested unless they gained military or political influence in return. Some even suggested sending troops to Niger in exchange for aid. To a proud but struggling nation, that kind of help came with too high a price. And that's when China stepped in with a different kind of offer. Infrastructure, technology, and investment without overt military strings attached. For a country desperate for development, that looked like a lifeline. So what exactly did China build in Niger? And how did it transform the country's economy so quickly? Let's look at that next. When China entered Niger's story, it didn't start with oil rigs or giant refineries. It began with small but vital steps: fertilizer, water pumps, and bridges. Back in 2004, China donated nearly 300 tons of fertilizer and 11,000 water pumps to Niger. That might sound like small gestures, but for a country where drought is a yearly threat, these tools made a real difference. Fertilizer helps crops grow in poor soil. Pumps bring water where rain won't. For farmers who had never seen consistent harvests, this kind of help wasn't charity, it was survival. Then came infrastructure, the foundation of any economy. China helped fund and build key structures like the General Sani-Kunche Bridge in the capital, Niamey. It's almost a kilometer long, linking two of the city's busiest districts across the Niger River. Before it was built, crossing from one side to the other could take hours. After it opened in 2021, that trip took minutes. Bridges like that don't just connect roads. They connect opportunities, jobs, markets, schools, hospitals. But the biggest transformation came from one word: oil. For years, Niger knew it had oil underground, but Western companies explored, then left, saying it was too risky and not profitable enough. China saw things differently. Around 2003, Chinese state-owned companies signed long-term agreements to develop Niger's oil fields, particularly the Agadem Basin, one of the country's richest deposits. This wasn't just drilling a few wells. China invested in an entire oil ecosystem: the Agadem and Bilma oil fields for production, the Zinder refinery for processing crude oil into fuel, built and run with Chinese management, and a 462-kilometer pipeline through desert terrain to move oil efficiently. Altogether, the investment reached nearly $5 billion, massive for Niger's small economy. Under Chinese management, the refinery began processing 20,000 barrels per day, enough to cover Niger's domestic fuel needs and even create surplus for export. That changed everything. For the first time, Niger was no longer just importing fuel. It could produce and sell its own. Fuel prices fell sharply. According to local reports, diesel that once cost over $1 per liter dropped to a fraction of that. Farmers could run generators. Transportation costs eased. Businesses had steady energy. China's role wasn't only about oil revenue. It gave Niger something more valuable: energy independence. The numbers tell the story. By 2024, China's oil projects accounted for around 10% of Niger's GDP, 12.5% of total tax revenue, and provided more than 4,000 local jobs. In a country where every job matters, that's huge. Schools, clinics, and new roads around project sites followed. Small signs of stability in a country used to struggle. And yet, behind this success, pressure was quietly building. Running a refinery isn't easy. It needs trained engineers, steady funding, and political calm, things Niger's government didn't always have. The more the economy relied on Chinese projects, the more fragile that relationship became. So if China's investment brought so much progress, why did Niger suddenly turn against it? Let's see what pushed the partnership to collapse. For nearly 2 decades, Niger and China seemed like steady partners. But in early 2025, that partnership cracked, fast and publicly. On the surface, it started with what looked like a salary dispute, but underneath was a storm of money problems, political pride, and desperation. The official story sounded simple. Niger accused Chinese oil companies of paying their managers 3 to 4 times more than local employees, and of not hiring enough local subcontractors. Government officials said this was unfair, that Chinese companies were hoarding profits instead of sharing them. It sounded like a fight for equality, but the truth ran much deeper. Behind closed doors, Niger was facing a severe financial crisis. Its foreign exchange reserves, the money it needs to buy imports and pay debts, had dropped so low that it could barely cover 2 to 3 months of national expenses. That's like having only a few weeks of cash left to keep an entire country running. To stay afloat, the government had borrowed about $400 million from Chinese oil companies the year before. The loan was meant to be repaid after a year. But when the deadline came, Niger couldn't pay. Instead, its leaders tried to renegotiate the deal, demanding a bigger share of oil profits, increasing their cut from 15% to 30%. For context, that's an unusually high demand in the global oil industry. When Chinese negotiators refused, the talks turned sour. Niger's military-led government, already under pressure to show strength at home, saw an opportunity to look tough by taking aim at the foreign company itself. Soon, things escalated dramatically. The government froze Chinese corporate accounts, seized control of refineries, and ordered senior Chinese executives to leave the country within 48 hours. Officials claimed it was about fairness, but observers saw something else: a government running out of money and trying to rewrite contracts by force. To make matters even more complicated, Niger's new rulers reportedly felt they had powerful friends elsewhere. They had backing from the Russian Wagner Group, which gave them confidence that they didn't have to fear losing Chinese support completely. That sense of military backing might have encouraged them to act boldly, believing they could control the situation once the Chinese left. But this move, however politically bold, was economically reckless. By forcing out the very people who ran the oil system, Niger was gambling its most valuable lifeline, the energy sector. It was like taking the mechanics out of an airplane mid-flight and saying, "We'll handle it ourselves." The plane might fly for a few minutes on momentum, but eventually it starts to fall. And that's exactly what happened next. Once the Chinese engineers and technicians left, Niger's oil system began to break down almost overnight, and the results were devastating. When Niger's government ordered the Chinese engineers and executives to leave, the effect was almost instant. Within days, fuel stations started to run dry. Trucks waited in long lines at depots, only to be told there was no diesel left. Power cuts spread through the cities. Prices for fuel, which had been stable for years, tripled or even quadrupled in some places. It wasn't sabotage or punishment from China. The problem was simpler, and honestly more dangerous. The system depended on expertise that had just vanished. Running an oil refinery isn't like flipping a switch. It's a delicate industrial process that needs constant supervision. From refining temperature control to chemical balancing, pressure management, and safety monitoring. Even a small mistake can shut the entire system down. Chinese technicians had been the ones keeping those systems stable for years. When they left, the local staff, though capable and hard-working, didn't have enough experience to run it all alone. Think of it like a giant orchestra suddenly losing its conductor and half its musicians mid-performance. The music doesn't just get worse, it collapses into chaos. That's what happened inside Niger's Zinder refinery, the beating heart of its energy network. Without proper management and access to spare parts or international support, output plunged. Reports from local media painted a grim picture. The refinery that once processed 20,000 barrels per day fell to less than 5,000. Gas stations ran out of supply. Long queues formed in cities like Niamey and Maradi, stretching for blocks. The black market exploded. People were buying diesel in plastic jugs at 3 to 4 times the normal price. This collapse rippled far beyond the oil fields. Truckers couldn't deliver food or goods. Farmers couldn't run their water pumps. Public transport costs soared. Even hospitals that relied on generators struggled to keep the lights on. And here's the harsh irony. The same government that had promised to take back control of its oil found itself more dependent than ever, not on foreign companies, but on emergency imports and smugglers. The dream of independence had turned into an energy crisis. At the same time, foreign investors were watching closely. For them, Niger had just sent a loud signal. Contracts could be broken, and foreign staff could be expelled overnight. That scared off not just Chinese capital, but potential investors from everywhere else. Confidence, the invisible currency of global business, was gone. So now Niger was stuck. No fuel, no foreign partners, and a collapsing economy. The question was, could it recover from this? Or was this the start of something much worse? The first week after the Chinese engineers left, people still hoped the crisis would pass. Maybe it was just a temporary disruption, a hiccup. But by the second week, that hope started to fade. Fuel prices kept climbing, buses stopped running, and grocery shelves began to thin out. The problem wasn't just oil anymore. It was everything that depended on oil, which, in modern life, means almost everything. In Niger, where much of the economy runs on small-scale trade and transport, diesel isn't a luxury, it's oxygen. Farmers need it for irrigation pumps, truckers need it to move food, and shopkeepers need it to keep their fridges running. When fuel prices tripled, it was like someone had just added a tax on every meal, every trip, every delivery. Take the markets of Niamey, the capital. A bag of rice that cost 8,000 CFA francs suddenly jumped to 12,000. Transport fares doubled overnight. Taxi drivers parked their cars because it cost more to buy fuel than they could earn in a day. The poorest families, who already spent most of their income on food, had no safety net. For them, this wasn't an economic issue. It was survival. Inflation, once in check, began spiraling. Official data became hard to verify, but street prices told the truth. Within a month, basic goods cost 30 to 50% more than before. Small businesses closed. Schools with no fuel for generators sent kids home early. Even hospitals faced power cuts that endangered patients. The government tried to calm the situation. Officials went on TV promising quick fixes, alternative suppliers, new trade deals, and emergency shipments from neighboring countries. But neighboring countries like Nigeria and Chad were facing their own shortages and couldn't spare much. Importing by road was expensive and slow, and Niger's landlocked geography made everything worse. Meanwhile, the black market boomed. People began smuggling fuel across borders, often at triple prices, selling it in plastic bottles on the roadside. It was risky and illegal, but for many, it was the only way to keep earning. In a cruel twist, this underground trade became the only reliable supply chain the country had left. At the same time, the government's cash flow was drying up. With oil production and exports down, tax revenue collapsed, and so did foreign currency inflows. The $400 million loan owed to Chinese companies still hung over them. But now, there was no way to pay it back. Niger's leaders faced a brutal equation: either find a way to restore production or watch the economy unravel completely. By now, public frustration was rising. On social media, citizens started asking the hard question: was kicking out the Chinese really worth it? But while Niger struggled to stay afloat, Beijing was watching too, quietly but strategically. And the next moves from China would show that this story wasn't over yet. When Niger's government expelled the Chinese oil executives and froze their accounts, Beijing didn't lash out publicly. There were no dramatic speeches, no threats of sanctions, no fiery press conferences. Instead, China went quiet, and that silence was its strategy. You see, China doesn't usually react to this kind of crisis with emotion. It reacts with calculation. In diplomacy, silence can be louder than shouting. And in this case, it sent a very clear message: you'll feel our absence more than our anger. Within weeks, that message became reality. Without Chinese management, Niger's oil sector, which made up over 10% of its economy, was practically frozen. No exports, no revenue, and no easy way to restart production. China didn't need to do anything aggressive. It simply stopped the flow of technical support, spare parts, and financing that kept the system running. That alone was enough to bring Niger's economy to its knees. Behind the scenes, however, China wasn't completely passive. Beijing quietly recalled its nationals, secured its assets, and made sure the world understood that the rupture wasn't its fault. State media framed the issue carefully. Niger had violated agreements and endangered the partnership. In international business circles, this painted Niger as an unreliable partner, a place where contracts weren't safe. That reputational hit hurt Niger far beyond China. Other African countries were watching too. Nations like Chad, Angola, and Ethiopia, all of which have major Chinese investments, took note. The lesson was simple. Expelling your biggest investor might win applause at home for a week, but it can cripple your economy for years. Meanwhile, China still had leverage. Because Niger owed it hundreds of millions in loans, any hope of restructuring that debt now depended on China's goodwill. And since China controls a massive portion of global oil infrastructure, even finding new technical partners became nearly impossible. Western companies were hesitant to step in, not out of loyalty to China, but out of caution. If Niger could kick out one foreign power, who's to say they wouldn't do it again? So while Niger's leaders tried to look strong, they were cornered. The country needed Chinese expertise to restart production, Chinese investment to refinance debt, and even Chinese machinery to keep the refineries working. The power dynamic had flipped. China didn't need Niger. Niger still needed China. Beijing knew it. So it waited, quietly, confidently, like a chess player watching the other side run out of moves. But China's patience doesn't mean forgiveness. The next phase was about choices. And for Niger, every option came with a price. By the time Niger's oil prices had soared by 300%, the situation had become unsustainable. Fuel shortages paralyzed transportation, blackouts swept across cities, and inflation spiraled out of control. Ordinary citizens, already struggling to survive on less than $2 a day, suddenly couldn't afford basic necessities. Farmers couldn't run their irrigation pumps. Hospitals faced power outages. In Niamey, the capital, nights turned pitch dark and anger filled the streets. The government's gamble had backfired catastrophically. They thought removing China would make them look strong and independent. Instead, they found themselves isolated and desperate. No Western country stepped in to help. The United States and Europe were busy dealing with their own economic challenges, and few investors wanted to risk money in a country that had just seized foreign assets. Russia's Wagner Group might have offered some military backing, but when it came to rebuilding pipelines or restarting refineries, they had nothing to offer. Realizing the damage, Niger quietly tried to reach out to Beijing again. Officials sent signals through diplomatic channels, expressing regret and asking for talks to resume. But China wasn't in a hurry. Beijing had already filed a case through international arbitration, demanding compensation for its losses, and it wanted guarantees, legal, political, and economic, before returning. And this is where the story becomes about more than just Niger. Across Africa, leaders started to watch and reflect. Countries like Zambia, Kenya, and Tanzania, all with deep Chinese ties, saw how quickly an economy could unravel when those ties were cut. For them, the Niger episode became a case study in interdependence, proof that modern partnerships aren't just about aid or loans, but about trust and mutual benefit. The irony is hard to miss. Niger's leaders pushed China away to gain control, but ended up losing control of their own economy. It's a reminder that in global trade, power isn't always about politics or military strength. It's about who keeps the engines running. And in Niger's case, those engines were literally Chinese-built. Today, as Niger struggles to stabilize, its government faces two hard truths. First, rebuilding the relationship with China will take time, humility, and perhaps even concessions. Second, no other nation is lining up to take China's place. The world has become more cautious, and Niger's reputation as a reliable partner has been damaged. Still, there's a sliver of hope. History shows that China values long-term partnerships, even with countries that stumble. If Niger can demonstrate genuine commitment to cooperation and transparency, Beijing might eventually return, because the potential is still enormous. Rich oil fields, strategic geography, and an entire economy waiting to grow again. In the end, Niger's story isn't just about oil or politics. It's about the fragility of development when trust breaks down. It's a warning to every developing nation that progress is built not only with money and machines, but with relationships that must be protected carefully. And as for China, it doesn't need to shout or threaten. Its influence speaks through outcomes. In this case, one broken partnership was enough to show an entire continent what happens when you try to stand tall. But forget who's holding the ladder. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll keep exploring global shifts like this, how nations rise, fall, and learn from their choices, so you can understand the real stories shaping our world today.